Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Carol's Corner. So, I did a tour yesterday where I was talking about the Cedars of Lebanon. Recently, my scripture said, "The righteous shall stand strong like the cedar of Lebanon." Now, I used to read that, but I didn't know really what that meant until I saw this beautiful tree here at the Biblical History Center. So once I pointed it out yesterday, that made me start thinking about trees. So I went with my question of the day to Christy, our Director of Education and Programming. Christy, does the cedar of Lebanon really grow in Lebanon? Where else does it grow, and why do we have it here?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the reason why we have it here is because cedars of Lebanon are referenced many times in Scripture. So we see that David commissions the king of Lebanon to bring lumber for the building of his palace, later on for Solomon's temple. And so there is interaction between these nations in the Old Testament. But even today, the cedar of Lebanon is a really big deal. It's actually the focal point of their national flag. And so even though we picture Israel as often being a very dry, deserty place, the further you go north in that region of the country, the more rainfall you're going to get. And so the more likely you are to get beautiful lumber like this.
Well, I'm glad you told me that, because a guest frequently asks me about how dry it is in Israel. And I know that much of the land is dry, but you're saying to me there's a good fertile spot in Israel too?
Absolutely, absolutely. So kind of technical, but there is a low pressure center over the island of Cyprus, which is just off of the northern Israel's Mediterranean coast. And so a lot of rain is kind of focused, swirling around in that area in the Mediterranean. So this means that the farther north you go in Israel, the closer you get to that low pressure center and the more rainfall you're going to get every year. Whereas if you're heading in the other direction, if you're headed down south to the desert, to the Negev, towards the Sinai, you're going to get less and less rainfall every year.
So am I right that it's basically a period of about May to October when there's no rain?
Right. So through May all the way through the end of October, usually this is what they would consider the dry season in Israel. And then starting November 1st through late spring, this is what they would call the rainy season, where we're going to get a lot more rainfall. This is when we're finally going to see some rain down in that more deserty region of the country. But rain still is fairly sporadic there.
Not rain like we have in Georgia.
Absolutely, no. And there's no humidity either. So really, you're just going to get your moisture from a few rainfalls down there, and then maybe one or two flash floods that come from Jerusalem in the rainy season.
So an average rainfall would be?
It's hard to calculate an average because, again, it is so sporadic. But usually I would say maybe about 8 inches would be a good average for the whole year.
We got that last week.
I know.
Okay, so very different.
Yes.
Very different.
Very dry.
Now, I also like to talk about the wood when I'm out here, and part of what I tell our guests is that normally we think of stone as the primary building material, and we don't cut down trees that we need for shade and for food. So, I mean, this is a big tree right here, and I'm thinking, well, that'd make a good lumber product. What is the deal with wood, and why is it important in this culture, and what should I tell our guests?
You were absolutely right when you said that stone is the main building material that we see used in ancient Israel, and that's just because that's what's readily available. The trees that do grow, especially again as you go further south, they're going to be needed for foodstuffs, occasionally for fuel for the fires as well. You got to keep that in mind. Don't have electricity necessarily, so you have to cook your food all over a fire. And we actually find accounts of the poor, those who are very, very poor in antiquity. It's classified that they can't even afford fuel for their fire because wood is so precious. So they pay someone else to cook their food or just buy fast food in the marketplace. So we're seeing lots of wood used for fuel, like I said, or maybe some of your fancier, more important buildings like we see with David's palace, with Solomon's temple. But usually your average person is just going to use a little bit of wood in the structure of their home, probably most likely for the roof, as you need a lighter building material.
So what kind of trees would I find in Israel?
So there's actually many different varieties of trees that you're going to find. Probably the most common would be the date palm. We can't grow those here in our garden just because it does get a little too cold here in Georgia for those. They don't really like to drop below 45 degrees. But date palms we know were and still are quite prevalent. Not only were the dates eaten for food, but we find accounts from King David's time of those dates being turned into wine and fermented. And even recently, archaeologists have uncovered some date pits and date seeds from antiquity, and they were actually able to regrow date trees from those seeds from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Some other trees that we might find would be myrtle trees, cedar trees, cypress trees, fig trees, olive trees, almond trees, pomegranates. So these, a lot of
Things
them,
we need for food.
Absolutely, absolutely. So one of the reasons why we want to chop down as little wood as possible also and use mostly stone in our construction is because the trees that are available to us usually provide us with some sort of food stuff that we don't want to go without.
Okay, I'm going to ask the hard question. This gets asked a lot, especially in the Easter season. We all know about the beautiful legend of the dogwood. I'm a storyteller. I love to hear the story of the dogwood. But the truth of the matter is the dogwood would probably not be native to Israel.
So while that is a beautiful legend and the story that goes with it is very emotional, unfortunately it is not true. Dogwoods do not grow native in Israel. Although the legend is very sweet, Jesus was not crucified on a dogwood tree. If anything, it could have possibly been an olive tree. There are many olive trees, or maybe some sort of like cedar tree or something. We do know too that there were some oak trees in Israel. However, they were often used for pagan cult practices, so he probably was not crucified on one of those, as the Romans would have revered those oak trees as holy sites.
So on the subject of Easter, we're looking at the tree and we talk about the crossbeam. And one of the things I found fascinating, and I want to expand with you here, is the fact that the Romans probably reused the crossbeam. So it was not one unique cross to one unique prisoner. So this is like early recycling.
Absolutely, absolutely. So again, wood is scarce. That's why they're importing some of these larger trees from Lebanon, like we read about in the Old Testament, or they're using it for food or for their roof or for fuel. And so they want to reuse this wood. Wood is an easier surface to crucify somebody on. And so we want to try and reuse it as much as possible. We see people being crucified on living trees as well as beams that have been cut down for the purpose. And then not only would they reuse the beam, the cross beam and the tree, we also read instances of them reusing the nails as well for crucifixion. So this is early recycling. They wanted to be very efficient with the ways that they are executing people at this time.
So you see, I have a lot of questions working here at the Biblical History Center, and there's a good chance you have questions too. So if you have questions, leave them in the comments below, and Christy and I will address them in our next opportunity.